Clean the bathroom before the guests arrive, Evelyn. And please don't sit in the living room looking miserable like last time, my daughter-in-law said the moment I stepped into my son's house carrying the blueberry pie I had baked at 5 that morning. Jason stood behind the kitchen island with a beer in his hand. He looked at me for half a second before lowering his eyes to the marble countertop. That hurt more than Melissa's words ever could. I stood there quietly with my overnight bag hanging from my shoulder and the pie dish warming my hands through the thin fabric oven mitt I still carried. Outside, rain tapped softly against the front porch railing, and somewhere upstairs I could hear my granddaughter laughing at a cartoon. The house smelled like vanilla candles and expensive furniture polish. It did not smell like home anymore. Melissa crossed her arms over her cream-colored sweater and looked down at my suitcase. You can leave that in the laundry room for now, she said. The guest room is being used for coats tonight. I nodded slowly. Of course. My voice sounded strange to my own ears. Smaller somehow. I followed her through the kitchen while my wet sneakers squeaked softly against the hardwood floor. She opened a cabinet beneath the sink and handed me yellow rubber gloves and a bottle of cleaner. The downstairs bathroom needs attention, she said. People will be here in less than an hour. Then she smiled. Not warmly. Not cruelly either. Just the kind of smile people use when asking hotel staff for extra towels. I looked toward Jason again. My son rubbed the back of his neck and avoided my eyes. Mom, Melissa's been stressed planning this fundraiser, he muttered. Just help her out a little, okay? Help her out. I remembered when helping meant babysitting Sophie while they took weekend trips to Napa Valley. Helping meant wiring Jason $12,000 from my retirement account when his business failed 3 years ago. Helping meant co-signing loans, cooking casseroles after Melissa's cosmetic procedures, folding laundry during holidays while everyone else watched football. Somehow helping had slowly turned into servitude, and I had been too lonely to notice the difference. Sure, I whispered. Melissa was already walking away in her heels, tapping rapidly across the kitchen tile while scrolling through something on her phone. Her blonde hair was curled perfectly, and diamond earrings shimmered beneath the recessed lighting. She looked beautiful in the polished way magazine women always do. Expensive. Untouchable. I carried my pie to the counter carefully beside trays of catered appetizers and bottles of sparkling water arranged like a showroom display. No one thanked me for bringing dessert. No one even looked at it. The downstairs bathroom smelled faintly of bleach and lavender. I closed the door quietly behind me and stared at my reflection in the mirror for a long moment. At 68, my face had softened around the jawline, and silver streaks framed my tired blue eyes. I looked like someone's grandmother. Someone kind. Someone easy to overlook. I slipped on the gloves slowly. The sound snapped softly against my wrists in the silent bathroom. As I scrubbed water spots from the sink, I could hear Melissa laughing upstairs while music drifted faintly through the vents. Every few minutes another car pulled into the driveway outside. Doors slammed. Voices floated through the house. Somewhere along the way, I had become invisible inside my own family. 20 years ago, when Jason was 19 and sleeping on my couch after his father died, he used to hold my hand during thunderstorms because he worried I felt lonely in the house alone. Back then he called every night from college just to ask if I had eaten dinner. Back then he still looked at me like I mattered. I wiped down the mirror carefully until every fingerprint disappeared. Then I noticed something hanging in the hallway outside the bathroom. A large framed family portrait I had never seen before. Jason stood beside Melissa near the stone fireplace in matching cream sweaters while Sophie smiled between them holding their golden retriever. The photographer had captured golden evening sunlight behind their heads, making them look like the perfect American family. My chest tightened when I realized what felt wrong about the picture. I wasn't in it. Not even in the background. Not even a chair left empty for me. I stood frozen in the hallway holding the spray bottle while guests laughed somewhere beyond the dining room. Melissa brushed past me carrying wine glasses. "Oh good, you're done," she said without stopping. "And Evelyn? After dinner, could you keep an eye on the trash bins outside? Last time raccoons got into them." Then she disappeared again into the glowing warmth of the party while I remained standing alone beneath a family portrait that proved something I had spent years refusing to admit. I was no longer being treated like Jason's mother. I was being managed like hired help. And the worst part was not Melissa's cruelty. It was the silence of the son I once believed would always protect me. By 7:30 that evening, the house no longer sounded like a home. It sounded like a hotel lobby. Wine glasses clinked against marble countertops while strangers laughed too loudly at stories that were not funny. Expensive perfume floated through the air mixed with roasted garlic and lemon butter from the catering trays Melissa had ordered from a restaurant downtown. I stood quietly near the kitchen sink drying serving spoons with a dish towel while people walked past me without asking my name. A woman in a green velvet blazer smiled politely and said, "Could we get more napkins in here?" before realizing I was not part of the catering staff. Her cheeks turned pink for a second. "Oh, I am sorry." I smiled gently and handed her the napkins anyway. "It is fine," I said. And strangely enough, it was. Not because it did not hurt, but because pain loses some of its power once it becomes familiar. Melissa moved through the dining room like she owned every inch of air inside it. She laughed with one hand touching Jason's arm constantly, her wedding ring sparkling beneath the chandelier light. Every few minutes she glanced toward me, not to check if I was comfortable, but to make sure I was still useful. "Evelyn, can you refill the ice bucket?" "Evelyn, the bathroom trash is overflowing again." "Evelyn, Sophie left juice upstairs." Each request came wrapped in fake sweetness sharp enough to cut skin. Jason stayed close to the guests all evening. He shook hands, discussed real estate investments, nodded along to conversations about private schools and interest rates. Every once in a while his eyes drifted toward me before quickly looking away again. I realized then that guilt changes people physically. It makes them unable to hold eye contact for very long. Around 8 o'clock, Sophie wandered into the kitchen holding a tablet against her chest. Her blonde curls were messy from running through the house all evening. "Grandma," she whispered, tugging gently on my sweater sleeve, "Mom said you are sleeping downstairs because guests matter more tonight. Is that true?" Children ask questions adults spend years avoiding. I folded the dish towel carefully before answering. "It is only for a few days, sweetheart." She looked confused. "But this is your family too." My throat tightened unexpectedly. Before I could answer, Melissa appeared behind her carrying an empty charcuterie board. "Sophie, honey, do not bother Grandma right now. She is helping." Helping. Always helping. Melissa never used words accidentally. I watched her guide Sophie away toward the living room where warm yellow light spilled across polished hardwood floors. Guests sat comfortably on furniture I had partially paid for years ago when Jason called me crying about overdue mortgage payments. Back then he promised it was temporary. Back then he hugged me after every check I wrote. I remembered sitting alone at my kitchen table balancing my retirement savings account late at night while wondering if I could still afford my blood pressure medication after helping him. Somehow none of that mattered anymore. By 9 o'clock my feet ached inside my wet sneakers, but I kept moving quietly through the house collecting empty glasses and folded cocktail napkins. The laundry room where Melissa had placed my suitcase was barely larger than a walk-in closet. A twin-air mattress leaned against the wall beside detergent bottles and stacks of paper towels from Costco. Every time I opened the door to place something inside, I caught sight of my overnight bag sitting beside the washing machine like I was some distant relative who had overstayed a welcome nobody truly offered. At one point I stepped outside through the side door just to breathe cold air for a minute. The rain had stopped, leaving the driveway slick beneath the porch lights. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself while distant music drifted through the walls behind me. Then I heard voices through the slightly open kitchen window. Melissa's voice first. Calm. Irritated. "I am serious, Jason. Your mother cannot keep hanging around forever." A long silence followed. Then Jason sighed heavily. "I know." Those 2 words landed harder than any insult Melissa had thrown at me all day. I stood frozen beside the recycling bins while water dripped slowly from the roof gutters. Melissa lowered her voice, but I still heard enough. "If she sells the condo this year, We can finally breathe. Otherwise we are drowning. Jason muttered something too quiet to understand. Melissa answered immediately. Then stop feeling guilty and talk to her. I stepped back from the window before they could see my shadow beneath the porch light. My hands trembled slightly, though not from the cold. For months I had convinced myself Melissa simply disliked me. That was easier to accept. Easier than believing my own son had slowly allowed me to become part of some financial calculation inside his marriage. I looked through the kitchen window one last time. Jason leaned against the counter with both hands covering his face while Melissa scrolled through her phone beside him completely calm. They looked less like husband and wife and more like business partners discussing overdue bills. Somewhere inside the house, guests laughed loudly again. I suddenly realized something that frightened me more than Melissa's cruelty. She was not the one truly breaking my heart anymore. Jason was. I barely slept that night. The air mattress shifted every time I moved, making soft plastic sounds in the dark laundry room while the washing machine hummed faintly beside me. Around midnight I heard Jason and Melissa upstairs arguing in low voices behind their bedroom door. I could not make out every word, but I heard enough to understand the shape of their marriage now. Money sat at the center of every conversation like a third person living between them. Around 1 a.m, the house finally became quiet. I stared at the ceiling for a long time with my cardigan folded beneath my head as a pillow. There was a time when Jason used to call me whenever life overwhelmed him. After his father died, he once drove 2 hours through a snowstorm just because I sounded sad on the phone. He arrived carrying takeout soup and sat at my kitchen table until sunrise because he did not want me grieving alone. That memory hurt now because it reminded me that cruel people do not appear overnight. They disappear slowly. Piece by piece. Compromise by compromise. Silence by silence. The next morning I woke up before everyone else out of habit. Outside the small basement window above the laundry sink, pale grey light stretched across the quiet neighborhood. Expensive SUVs sat parked neatly along the curb while sprinklers clicked softly across perfect green lawns. The whole subdivision looked like a postcard for comfortable American life. I tied my hair back and quietly made coffee in the kitchen while the house remained still. For a few peaceful minutes, nobody was asking me for anything. I wrapped both hands around the warm mug and stood looking out the window toward the backyard where Sophie's swing set glistened with rainwater. Then I noticed a stack of unopened envelopes near the refrigerator. Final notices. Past due balances. One envelope from a luxury credit card company had red lettering across the front. Another was from the Homeowners Association. I looked away quickly when I heard footsteps upstairs. Melissa entered the kitchen wearing silk pajamas and immediately frowned when she saw me holding coffee. "Oh good, you are awake," she said. "Can you make pancakes? Sophie likes yours better." "No, good morning." "No, thank you for helping yesterday. Just another task waiting for me before sunrise." "Of course," I answered automatically. She opened the refrigerator and sighed dramatically while scanning shelves already filled with groceries. "Jason is stressed lately," she said casually while pouring almond milk into a glass. "The economy has everybody struggling." I nodded without speaking. Melissa leaned against the counter studying me carefully. "You still own that condo near Clearwater Beach, right?" There it was. Finally spoken aloud. Not directly. Not honestly. But close enough. I cracked eggs into a bowl slowly to buy myself time. "Yes," I said quietly. "Your father bought it 30 years ago." Melissa smiled faintly. "It must be worth a fortune now." I stirred pancake batter while the silence between us thickened. Somewhere upstairs Sophie laughed at something on television. Melissa checked her phone again before speaking. "Jason mentioned you hardly use the place anymore." I looked down at the frying pan while butter melted across the surface. "I spend a few weeks there every winter." "Still," she continued lightly, "maintaining property at your age must be exhausting." "At your age." Funny how people begin talking about age once they start planning your future for you. I flipped the pancake carefully and watched steam rise toward the kitchen lights. "I manage just fine," I replied. Melissa smiled again, but this time I saw impatience beneath it. I only mean that maybe simplifying your life would make things easier. Easier for whom? She did not need to say it. I already knew. Jason entered the kitchen a few minutes later wearing wrinkled sweatpants and exhaustion across his face. He kissed Melissa quickly before glancing toward me. "Morning, Mom." His voice sounded cautious now, almost formal. I remembered when he used to hug me first thing every morning during holidays. Melissa handed him coffee immediately while I stood by the stove flipping pancakes like background furniture. "Smells great," he said absent-mindedly without looking at me. Then his phone buzzed. The color drained from his face after reading whatever message appeared on the screen. Melissa noticed too. "What happened?" she whispered sharply. Jason shook his head and shoved the phone into his pocket. "Nothing." But his hands trembled slightly while reaching for his coffee mug. I pretended not to notice. Years of motherhood teach women how to recognize fear even when people try hiding it. During breakfast, Sophie happily drowned pancakes in syrup while talking about a school field trip. Melissa interrupted constantly to answer emails. Jason barely ate at all. Every few minutes he checked his phone again with growing panic in his eyes. Finally Melissa leaned toward him and whispered, "You need to handle this before she finds out." She thought I could not hear. Maybe she forgot older women become experts at listening carefully because people stop noticing us after 60. I cut my pancakes into small squares slowly while pretending complete indifference. But inside, something had begun shifting quietly into place. The sadness was still there. The humiliation too. But now another feeling had joined them. Clarity. That afternoon, Melissa suggested we all go shopping for decorations for Sophie's upcoming school fundraiser. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful while she grabbed her designer handbag from the kitchen counter. "It will be nice family time," she said with a smile too polished to trust. Jason barely looked up from his laptop when she said it. His face looked pale all morning, and dark circles sat beneath his eyes like bruises made from exhaustion instead of sleep. I noticed he checked his banking application at least 6 times during breakfast alone. Every time he did, his jaw tightened slightly. Fear changes the body before people admit it exists. We drove to an outdoor shopping center 20 minutes away where fountains sprayed beside expensive boutiques and women walked tiny dogs wearing sweaters that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. Melissa moved from store to store quickly, scanning price tags without actually caring about the prices. She carried herself like someone performing wealth instead of living it. Jason followed behind carrying bags while staring at his phone whenever Melissa looked away. I walked quietly beside them, feeling less like family and more like unpaid assistants trailing after wealthy strangers. At one point Melissa disappeared into a cosmetics store, leaving Jason and me alone near a bench outside a jewelry shop. For a moment neither of us spoke. Wind rustled through decorative palm trees overhead while Christmas music drifted faintly through outdoor speakers even though it was only October. Finally Jason cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mom, have you thought about downsizing lately?" There it was again. Another carefully disguised conversation about my condo. I kept my eyes on the fountain ahead of us. "Not really," I answered calmly. He nodded too quickly. "It is just, maintenance gets harder as people get older." People. Not you. Not Mom. People. I almost smiled at the distance hidden inside that word. "Your father managed that condo until he was 73, I replied softly. Jason rubbed both hands together nervously. "Things are expensive now. Insurance, taxes, repairs." I turned slowly toward him then. Really looked at him. His expensive watch. The forced confidence. The anxiety leaking through every movement. Suddenly I saw the frightened 19-year-old boy he used to be hiding underneath the middle-aged businessman costume. "How much trouble are you in?" I asked quietly. His entire body froze. For 1 second, I thought he might finally tell me the truth. Instead Melissa appeared carrying shopping bags and iced coffees before he could answer. "You two look serious," she laughed lightly. "Please tell me we are not discussing depressing grown-up things on such a beautiful day." Jason stood immediately like a child caught doing something wrong. The rest of the afternoon passed in strange silence. Melissa kept talking endlessly about kitchen renovations, private school tuition, and a couple's trip to Italy they wanted to take next summer. Jason barely contributed. Every time Melissa mentioned money, his expression darkened almost imperceptibly. That evening after dinner, I offered to clean the kitchen while Melissa took a bath upstairs. Jason remained alone at the dining table staring blankly at paperwork spread across the polished wood surface. I wiped plates slowly while pretending not to notice him. Then a single sheet slipped from the stack and drifted onto the floor beside my feet. I bent down automatically to pick it up. The logo at the top belonged to a debt collection law firm in Tampa. Final notice of legal action. Amount overdue, $187,000. My stomach tightened instantly. Jason grabbed the paper from my hand too quickly. "It is nothing," he said sharply. Too sharply. I looked at him quietly while dishwater dripped from my fingertips into the sink. "Jason." My voice softened the way it used to when he woke from nightmares as a child. Something inside him cracked for half a second. His shoulders slumped. He sat heavily in the dining chair and covered his face with both hands. "I thought things would recover after the market turned around," he whispered. "Then the investors backed out. Then the loans piled up." I remained silent. He laughed bitterly into his palms. "Melissa thinks selling your condo could solve everything." Hearing him say it aloud hurt differently than overhearing it through a window. Because now there were no misunderstandings left. Only truth. "And what do you think?" I asked. Jason lowered his hands slowly. His eyes looked red with exhaustion. "I do not know anymore." That answer told me everything I needed to understand. Not because he wanted my property, but because he had already reached the point where sacrificing me no longer felt impossible to him. Upstairs, I could hear Melissa's laughter floating faintly from a phone call with one of her friends. Bright. Carefree. Untouched by shame. I dried my hands carefully on a kitchen towel while Jason stared at the table, unable to meet my eyes. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. Jason at age 11 sitting beside me on our tiny apartment floor after his father lost his job. He handed me $23 from his birthday money and said, "Use this for bills, Mom." Back then he would have protected me from the world. Now he sat silently while the world inside his own house slowly erased me. And somehow that transformation felt far more tragic than the debt itself. The next morning Melissa behaved as if nothing important had happened the night before. That was one thing I had started noticing about her over the years. She could discuss someone's future like a business transaction and then ask if they wanted blueberry cream cheese on their bagel 5 minutes later. Some people carry guilt heavily. Others move through life untouched by it. I stood at the kitchen sink rinsing coffee mugs while sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the backyard. Sophie sat at the island coloring pictures with markers while cartoons played softly from the living room television. Jason had already left for what he called a client meeting, though judging from the tightness in his voice when he rushed out the door, I suspected it had more to do with banks than clients. Melissa scrolled through her tablet while sipping green juice from a glass bottle that probably cost $12. "I was thinking," she said casually without looking up, "there are some beautiful retirement communities near Clearwater now. Really high-end places. Yoga classes, waterfront dining, transportation services." I dried the same coffee mug for nearly 30 seconds before placing it carefully into the cabinet. "That sounds lovely," I replied evenly. Melissa smiled faintly, encouraged by my calmness. "Some of them even let residents keep small pets." Residents. The word settled coldly inside my chest. Not homeowners. Not independent women. Residents. Like people waiting quietly for the end of their lives while younger relatives sorted through inheritance paperwork. Sophie looked up suddenly from her coloring book. "Grandma is not old," she announced seriously. "She still drives better than Dad." I almost laughed despite everything. Melissa forced a smile. "Nobody said Grandma was old, sweetheart." But we both knew exactly what she had been saying. Around noon, Melissa asked if I could pick Sophie up from dance practice later because she had a spa appointment with friends. "You do not mind, right?" she asked while fastening expensive gold bracelets around her wrist. You are so good with schedules. Funny how people become complimentary when they need free labor. Of course, I said automatically. She kissed Sophie's forehead, grabbed her oversized sunglasses, and disappeared out the front door in a cloud of perfume and luxury shopping bags. Once the house became quiet again, I carried a basket of folded laundry upstairs toward the guest bathroom. Halfway down the hallway, I noticed Melissa's office door slightly open. I normally would have kept walking, but then I heard the faint sound of a printer running inside the room. Something about it made me pause. Papers sat scattered across her desk beside an open laptop and half-finished iced coffee. At the top of one document, I saw my name. Evelyn Carter. My heartbeat slowed instantly. Not faster. Slower. Like my body suddenly understood something serious was happening. I stepped inside carefully and picked up the paper nearest the edge of the desk. Durable power of attorney authorization. My fingers tightened around the page. Another document listed estimated market values for my Clearwater condo along with projected selling prices. There were handwritten notes in Melissa's sharp, elegant handwriting beside several numbers. Possible fast sale before spring. Cover immediate debt exposure. Move Evelyn closer afterward. Closer afterward. Like relocating furniture. I heard the garage door opening downstairs and quickly returned the papers exactly where I found them. Then I walked calmly back toward the kitchen carrying the laundry basket against my chest while my thoughts rearranged themselves into something colder and sharper than sadness. Jason entered through the mudroom looking exhausted. His tie hung loose around his collar and sweat darkened the edges of his blue dress shirt despite the mild weather outside. He froze slightly when he saw me standing there. Mom. Long day? I asked softly. He nodded while loosening his tie completely. Something like that. I studied him quietly for a moment. Then I said the words carefully. Melissa seems very interested in my condo lately. The color drained from his face so quickly it almost frightened me. He opened his mouth. Closed it again. She is just worried about your future, he finally said weakly. I looked at him for several seconds without speaking. Somewhere upstairs, the washing machine beeped softly at the end of a cycle. No, I said calmly. She is worried about yours. His eyes filled instantly with something raw and ashamed. For one brief moment I saw my son again beneath all the fear and avoidance. He sat heavily at the kitchen table and stared down at his trembling hands. I never wanted things to get this bad, he whispered. I believed him. That was the tragedy. Evil would have been easier to understand. But Jason was not evil. Weakness ruins people just as thoroughly sometimes. I poured him a glass of water and placed it gently in front of him. How much do you owe? I asked quietly. He swallowed hard before answering. Almost $400,000. The number settled heavily into the room between us. Outside, sprinklers clicked softly across the lawn while sunlight reflected against perfectly clean windows. The house still looked beautiful from the outside. That is the dangerous thing about financial ruin. It often wears expensive clothes and smiles politely at neighbors. Jason lowered his head into his hands again. I thought I could fix it before you noticed. I sat across from him slowly, folding my hands together on the table. Then for the first time since arriving at that house, I stopped feeling like a helpless guest inside someone else's life. Because finally, I understood exactly why they had been trying so hard to make me feel small. That night I lay awake staring at the faint glow from the laundry room ceiling light, listening to the quiet hum of the dryer beside me while the rest of the house slept peacefully upstairs. $400,000. The number repeated itself over and over in my mind like the ticking of a clock counting down toward something inevitable. I thought about all the years Jason spent building the image of success around himself. The luxury SUV in the driveway. The vacations posted online. The private school tuition. The dinner parties with catered food and imported wine. It all looked solid from the outside. But underneath, the entire life they built was balancing on debt and desperation. And somehow I had become part of their rescue plan without ever being asked. Around 6 in the morning, I quietly got dressed and slipped out the front door before anyone else woke up. The air outside felt cool and damp after the previous night's rain. I drove 20 minutes to a small diner near the highway that my husband, Frank, and I used to visit years ago during weekend trips to Clearwater. The booths were old, the coffee was too strong, and the waitress still called everyone honey no matter their age. It felt comforting in a way Melissa's spotless kitchen never could. I sat near the window with scrambled eggs and dry toast while sunlight slowly rose across the parking lot. Then I made a phone call I should have made much sooner. Richard Lawson speaking. Hearing Frank's old attorney answer the phone almost made me emotional. His voice sounded older now, rougher around the edges, but steady. "Richard," I said quietly. "It is Evelyn Carter." A long pause followed. Then warmth entered his voice instantly. "Evelyn. My goodness. It has been years." Richard had handled Frank's estate after his death 12 years earlier. He knew every detail about our finances, every property deed, every investment account. More importantly, he knew Frank trusted me completely. "I need to see you," I said softly. "Today if possible." By noon I was sitting inside Richard's downtown office surrounded by shelves of leather-bound legal books and framed photographs of fishing trips he took after retiring from full-time practice. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Richard listened quietly while I explained everything. Melissa's sudden interest in my condo. The financial documents. The power of attorney paperwork sitting openly on her desk. Jason's debt. The pressure disguised as concern. Richard removed his glasses slowly and leaned back in his chair. "Have you signed anything recently?" he asked. "No good." He folded his hands together carefully. "Because if someone is already preparing power of attorney documents without your consent, that tells me they expected to pressure you eventually." Pressure. Such a polite word for what family can become when money enters the room. Richard opened a file cabinet and pulled out copies of my property records. "Your Clearwater condo is fully protected and solely in your name," he explained. "Nobody can touch it without your authorization." Relief passed through me briefly before another thought surfaced. Could Jason borrow against it without my permission? Richard's expression hardened immediately. "Legally? No. But people in financial distress sometimes make very poor decisions." He paused before continuing carefully. "Evelyn, I am going to advise you as both your attorney and your friend. You need to protect yourself immediately." For the next hour we reviewed everything. My savings accounts. My retirement funds. My will. The condo deed. Richard asked calm practical questions while I answered with surprising steadiness. Somewhere during that meeting, something inside me changed quietly. The fear began disappearing. In its place came something colder. Clearer. By the time we finished, Richard had already arranged safeguards on my accounts and prepared paperwork preventing any unauthorized financial activity involving my property. Before I left, he looked at me carefully across his desk. "Frank worried about one thing before he died," he said softly. "He worried that you loved Jason so much you would someday sacrifice your own security trying to save him." My chest tightened unexpectedly. Frank had always understood people too well. Richard continued gently. "Helping someone and allowing them to consume your future are not the same thing." I drove back toward Jason's neighborhood just before sunset while orange light stretched across the Florida sky. Expensive homes lined the streets with perfectly trimmed hedges and decorative lanterns glowing warmly beside front doors. Everything still looked polished, stable, successful. But now I could see the desperation hidden underneath it all. When I pulled into the driveway, Melissa was standing outside speaking to a delivery driver about flower arrangements for another fundraiser event scheduled later that week. She smiled brightly when she saw me carrying a small folder from Richard's office. "You were out all day," she said casually. "Everything okay?" I smiled back just as politely. "Perfectly fine." For the first time since arriving at that house, I noticed uncertainty flicker briefly across her face. Just for a second. Then it vanished beneath her practiced composure. Inside, Jason sat alone at the kitchen island staring at unpaid invoices spread across the counter. He looked up when I entered. His eyes immediately moved toward the folder in my hands. Fear crossed his face so quickly he could not hide it in time. And in that exact moment, I realized something important. They were not treating me like family because they no longer saw me as a person. They saw me as access. A solution. A financial exit door disguised as an aging mother. But what neither of them understood yet was that I had finally stopped confusing love with surrender. 2 days later, Melissa hosted another fundraiser dinner at the house. By then I understood the pattern clearly. Every gathering existed for appearances. Every polished wine glass, every floral centerpiece, every carefully staged family photograph served one purpose only: to convince people their lives were thriving. Melissa spent the entire afternoon transforming the house into something that looked like a luxury magazine spread. White orchids covered the dining table. Caterers moved through the kitchen carrying silver trays of miniature crab cakes and smoked salmon appetizers. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers while candles flickered inside glass hurricanes across every surface. From the outside, it looked elegant, stable, wealthy. But now I could see the cracks beneath everything. Melissa wore a fitted navy dress with pearl earrings that matched the bracelet wrapped around her wrist. She moved quickly from room to room directing workers while pretending not to watch me. Ever since I returned from meeting Richard, she had become strangely cautious around me. Kinder, almost. Which somehow felt even more insulting than her usual coldness. "Evelyn, could you greet guests at the door while I finish upstairs?" she asked sweetly that evening. "People just adore you." 3 days earlier she had asked me to clean toilets before guests arrived. Now suddenly I was useful as decoration. I smiled politely. Of course. By 7 o'clock luxury cars lined both sides of the street outside. Men in expensive jackets discussed investments near the fireplace while women complimented each other's handbags beside the wine station. I stood near the front hallway greeting strangers who assumed I was either a distant relative or part of the event staff depending on how carefully they looked at me. Melissa floated gracefully through the crowd introducing Jason to potential business contacts with the desperation of someone trying to save a sinking ship using charm alone. Jason himself looked exhausted. His smile appeared half a second too late every time someone spoke to him. Sweat darkened the collar of his dress shirt despite the cool air conditioning flowing through the house. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward me nervously. He knew something had changed. He just did not know what yet. Around 8 o'clock, Melissa gathered everyone's attention near the dining room for a short speech about community outreach and local educational charities. She stood beneath soft chandelier light holding a champagne glass while guests smiled politely around her. "Tonight is really about family," she said warmly. "About supporting the people who help us build our lives." Then she turned toward me with that same polished smile. "And speaking of help, I could never manage this household without Evelyn. She practically keeps everything running around here." Laughter rippled lightly through the room. A few guests glanced toward me with polite amusement. One older man actually nodded at me the same way people acknowledge hardworking employees at country clubs. Melissa continued smiling beautifully while sipping champagne. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was placing me publicly beneath her without ever saying anything openly cruel. That was her talent. Humiliation wrapped in manners. For a moment the room felt strangely quiet around me. Not because people stopped talking, but because something inside me finally did. The need to explain myself. The need to earn dignity. The need to protect Jason from the consequences of his own choices. All of it disappeared at once. I set down the tray of empty glasses I had been carrying and folded my hands calmly in front of me. "You are right, Melissa," I said gently. "Families should support the people who build their lives." She blinked slightly, surprised by my calmness. Across the room Jason stared at me with growing concern. I continued quietly. "Frank and I spent 37 years building ours." Silence spread slowly now. Not dramatic. Just noticeable enough that nearby conversations faded. Melissa laughed lightly. "Evelyn always has stories," she joked while glancing around for support from the guests. But nobody laughed this time. I looked directly at Jason instead. Do you remember the first winter after your father died? I asked softly. His face tightened instantly. Mom, you were 19. We almost lost the house because I could not cover both the mortgage and your college tuition. Guests shifted uncomfortably while Melissa's smile began fading around the edges. I kept my voice calm. Steady. So I sold my wedding ring set. Jason lowered his eyes immediately. Evelyn, Melissa interrupted carefully, maybe this is not really the right setting for personal conversations. I finally turned toward her fully. No, I said quietly. Actually, I think this is the perfect setting. The room had gone almost completely silent now except for faint jazz music drifting from hidden speakers. I could see confusion spreading across several guests' faces. Melissa straightened her posture slightly, still trying to maintain control of the atmosphere. I only meant that families help each other, she said coolly. Exactly, I replied. Which is why I found it so surprising to discover paperwork preparing for control over my finances sitting openly in your office. Jason's head snapped upward instantly. Melissa's face lost color for the first time since I had known her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the caterers near the kitchen doorway had frozen in place. I reached calmly into my handbag and removed the folder Richard prepared for me earlier that day. Then I placed it carefully on the dining table beside the flower arrangements and untouched champagne glasses. I met with my attorney this week, I said softly. And after reviewing certain concerns, I decided to make permanent changes regarding my estate, my property, and my future care arrangements. Jason looked like someone had drained all the oxygen from the room. Melissa stared at the folder without blinking. And for the first time since arriving at that beautiful house, I was no longer the invisible woman standing quietly in the background. For several long seconds, nobody in the room moved. The only sound came from soft jazz music drifting through the ceiling speakers and the quiet clink of melting ice inside forgotten cocktail glasses. Melissa stared at the folder on the dining table as though it might explode if she touched it. Jason looked pale enough to disappear into the cream-colored walls behind him. Around us, wealthy strangers shifted awkwardly beside floral centerpieces and untouched appetizers, suddenly trapped inside a family moment far too real for a charity dinner. I rested one hand lightly against the back of a dining chair and kept my voice calm. Richard Lawson reviewed all my financial records this week, I continued softly. He also reviewed several documents that appeared to be prepared without my knowledge. Melissa recovered first. She let out a short nervous laugh and folded her arms carefully across her waist. Evelyn, I think there has been some misunderstanding. Her tone remained polished, but I noticed the strain beginning to crack underneath it. Those were only planning documents. Planning for what? I asked gently. She opened her mouth, but no answer came immediately. Across the room, Jason closed his eyes briefly like a man watching his life collapse in slow motion. I reached into the folder and removed several papers neatly clipped together. My attorney has already updated my estate directives, I said. My condo, my retirement accounts, and all related assets have been transferred into a protected trust effective immediately. A murmur spread quietly through the guests. Melissa's face went completely still. Transferred? She repeated carefully. To whom? I looked directly at her. Not to family. The silence afterward felt enormous. One woman near the fireplace slowly lowered her wine glass without taking a sip. Someone near the kitchen quietly whispered, "Oh my God." Jason stepped forward suddenly. "Mom, please," he said under his breath. "Not here." I turned toward him calmly. "You wanted me to discuss my future, Jason. So let us discuss it honestly." His shoulders sagged immediately. Melissa's composure finally began slipping around the edges. "This is unbelievable," she snapped quietly. "After everything we have done for you." I almost smiled at that. Not cruelly. Just sadly. "Everything you have done for me," I repeated softly. "Melissa, I slept beside a washing machine while guests used the bedroom upstairs." Several people visibly shifted uncomfortably. Melissa flushed red. "That was temporary. So was your kindness," I answered. Jason ran one trembling hand across his face while avoiding everyone's eyes. Mom, we were under pressure, he whispered. I know, I said gently. $400,000 of pressure. Several heads turned sharply toward him at once. Melissa looked horrified now, not because the truth existed, but because it had escaped into the room where other people could hear it. Image mattered more to her than morality ever had. Jason, she hissed quietly, you told her? He did not answer. He could not. The room no longer belonged to Melissa. Control had slipped away from her entirely. I looked around slowly at the beautiful house glowing beneath soft chandelier light. The imported flowers. The catered food. The expensive artwork hanging carefully along the walls. Everything suddenly looked exhausted to me. Like a stage set after actors forget their lines. Do you know what hurts most? I asked quietly. Nobody answered. Not the money. Not even the humiliation. I looked directly at Jason again. It is realizing my son watched me become smaller in this house day by day and convinced himself it was temporary. Jason's eyes filled instantly. He took one step toward me before stopping again. I never wanted to hurt you, he whispered. No, I replied softly. You just became willing to. The truth settled heavily across the room. Melissa grabbed her champagne glass too tightly, her knuckles turning white around the stem. This is incredibly dramatic, she muttered coldly. We were trying to help you simplify your life. By preparing legal control over my finances without discussing it with me first. I asked calmly. She said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. A man near the fireplace quietly picked up his coat. Then another guest followed. One by one, conversations dissolved into uncomfortable silence as people realized they were witnessing something far uglier than family disagreement. They were witnessing exposure. Real exposure. The kind no amount of designer clothing or luxury decor can survive. I carefully returned the documents to the folder and closed it. You do not need to worry about my future anymore, I said. Richard has arranged private long-term planning if I ever require assistance years from now. Until then, I will continue living independently. Melissa stared at me with open disbelief. You are cutting us out completely, she asked. Her voice sounded smaller now. Desperate even. I held her gaze steadily. No, Melissa, I answered quietly. You both removed yourselves the moment you stopped seeing me as family. Jason lowered himself slowly into a dining chair as though his legs could no longer support him. Around him, guests quietly collected purses and jackets, avoiding eye contact while moving toward the exits. Nobody wanted to remain inside a collapsing illusion. Sophie suddenly appeared at the staircase wearing pink pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes after waking from a nap upstairs. Grandma, she asked softly into the silence. Every adult in the room froze instantly. Sophie looked around in confusion before smiling when she saw me. Then she asked the simplest question anyone had spoken all evening. Are you still staying with us tonight? I looked at my granddaughter standing there beneath the warm hallway light, innocent and unaware of the greed, fear, and humiliation that had filled this house for so long. Then I glanced once more at Jason. At Melissa. At the beautiful life they had nearly destroyed trying to protect appearances. And for the first time in years, my answer came easily. No, sweetheart, I said softly to Sophie while guests stood frozen throughout the room holding coats and unfinished drinks. I do not think I will be staying here anymore. Sophie frowned in confusion, her small hand tightening around the staircase railing. Did I do something bad? My heart nearly broke hearing that question. Children always assume change is somehow their fault. I crossed the room slowly and knelt carefully in front of her despite the stiffness in my knees. No, baby, I whispered gently. You did nothing wrong. I brushed one loose curl away from her face while the adults behind me remained silent. Sometimes grown-ups forget how to treat people kindly. That is not your fault. Sophie nodded slowly even though she clearly did not fully understand. Maybe that was a blessing. Childhood should stay innocent for as long as possible. I kissed her forehead softly before standing again. Melissa looked impatient now, embarrassed by the emotional scene unfolding in front of people she desperately wanted to impress. Jason still sat motionless at the dining table, staring at the polished wood surface like a man unable to recognize the life collapsing around him. I picked up my handbag and the folder from Richard's office carefully. Then I turned toward the laundry room hallway where my suitcase still waited beside detergent bottles and stacked paper towels. Funny how humiliating that room had felt only days earlier. Now it no longer mattered. Once clarity arrives, humiliation loses much of its power. I rolled my suitcase quietly through the living room while guests stepped aside to let me pass. Nobody spoke. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked ashamed on Jason's behalf. Melissa crossed her arms tightly across her chest near the fireplace, still trying to preserve whatever remained of her pride. "You are seriously leaving over this?" she asked coldly. I paused near the front door and looked at her calmly. "No," I answered softly. "I am leaving because I finally understand it." Her expression tightened instantly. She wanted anger from me. Tears. Accusations. Something dramatic she could dismiss later as emotional instability. But calm truth unsettles people far more deeply than screaming ever does. Jason stood abruptly then, knocking lightly against the dining chair behind him. "Mom, wait." His voice cracked slightly. Every guest in the room looked toward him. He stepped closer slowly, his face pale beneath the chandelier light. "Please. We can fix this." I studied my son quietly for a long moment. The same blue eyes he had at 6 years old when he used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms. The same nervous habit of rubbing the back of his neck when frightened. Pieces of the boy I raised still existed inside the man standing before me. But adulthood reveals character eventually. And character is built from choices repeated over time. "Jason," I said gently, "people do not accidentally turn their mother into a financial strategy." His face crumpled slightly at those words. Melissa looked away toward the kitchen, unable to meet anyone's eyes now. Outside, headlights from departing cars swept across the front windows as guests quietly escaped the uncomfortable silence inside the house. Jason took another step closer. "I was scared," he whispered. "I know," I replied. "But fear explains behavior. It does not erase it." Tears filled his eyes suddenly, and for one brief moment I saw genuine shame instead of panic about money. That hurt more than everything else combined. Because if he had become completely heartless, leaving would have been easier. Sophie stood quietly near the staircase watching us with wide, uncertain eyes. I walked back toward her one final time and hugged her gently against my sweater. She smelled like baby shampoo and strawberry lotion. "Can I still visit you at the beach condo?" she whispered. I smiled softly. "Always." Then I handed her the small silver seashell necklace I had worn for years, the one Frank bought me during our first anniversary trip to Clearwater. "Keep this safe for me until your next visit." Sophie nodded seriously and closed her tiny hand around it. When I finally stepped outside, cool night air rushed softly against my face. The neighborhood looked peaceful beneath glowing streetlights and perfectly trimmed hedges. Somewhere nearby, sprinklers clicked rhythmically across dark lawns while distant crickets hummed beneath the trees. Behind me, the front door remained open, spilling warm light from the beautiful house that no longer felt connected to me at all. Jason followed me onto the driveway just as I reached my car. "Mom." I stopped but did not turn around immediately. His footsteps slowed behind me. "I never stopped loving you," he said quietly. I closed my eyes for 1 second before answering. Love without respect becomes something very dangerous. Silence settled between us beneath the soft Florida night sky. Finally I opened the driver's side door and placed my suitcase inside. Jason stood there helplessly with his hands shoved into his pockets like a lost teenager instead of a 42-year-old man drowning in consequences he helped create. "What happens now?" he asked weakly. I looked at him one last time. Not with anger. Not even hatred. Just clarity. "Now," I said softly, "you learn that some things cost more than money." Then I got into the car and drove slowly away from the house. I did not look back at the driveway. I did not look back at Melissa standing frozen in the doorway. I did not look back at the life I spent years shrinking myself to preserve. 20 minutes later I stopped near the ocean just outside Clearwater Beach where moonlight shimmered silver across dark water stretching endlessly into the distance. I sat quietly inside the parked car listening to waves break against the shore while warm salt air drifted through the cracked window. For the first time in years, nobody needed anything from me. Nobody was measuring my usefulness. Nobody was waiting for access to what I owned. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt free. And somewhere beyond the sound of the ocean, I could almost hear Frank's voice again reminding me of something I had forgotten for far too long. Growing older does not make a woman invisible. It simply reveals who was only looking at her for what they could take.